and it is a beautiful island. It's also very well known for spotting turtles. Hello and welcome back everyone. After my last two videos, which gave you some insight on how it is to spend some time on one of the outer islands that are around Okinawa Honto, specifically a day on Iwo-jima or weekend on Tokashiki-jima, I wanted to make another video about one of the other islands that are fairly close to Okinawa Honto. And this island I would recommend to do either as a day trip or as a weekend trip. You can do it as a day trip, but it's usually a little bit rushed, so generally I would recommend to do it as a weekend trip. The island I want to talk about is Zamami-jima. So Zamami-jima is also one of the Kerama islands. It's an island group that entails Tokashiki-jima, Aka-jima and Zamami-jima. But in my personal opinion, Zamami-jima is a lot more accessible than Tokashiki-jima or Aka-jima. And there are two reasons for this. One is that it has very affordable accommodation compared to Tokashiki-jima and Aka-jima. And the other one is that most of the times the ferry to Zamami-jima isn't booked out. I don't know what the reason is for this, but usually the ferries to Tokashiki-jima and Aka-jima are always booked out days in advance, sometimes weeks in advance, while the ferry to Zamami-jima usually has some open spots left. The exception for this is generally holidays and long weekends, where it's very popular among Japanese people to travel to these outer islands. But in general, you almost always have a better bet to get on the ferry to Zamami-jima than to get on the ferry to Tokashiki or Aka-jima. I visited Zamami-jima several times. I can remember at least 3 times when I visited Zamami-jima. And for some reason I never took any videos. I have very few pictures. However, I will insert any pictures I can find into this video so that you can actually see how nice the island is. And it is a beautiful island. It's also very well known for spotting turtles. So Zamami-jima has 2 main beaches, and one of them you are almost guaranteed, if you spend a weekend on Zamami-jima and you go snorkeling at different times of the days, you're almost guaranteed to spot turtles. I think I only had one trip where I didn't spot turtles, but that trip I also only went snorkeling one time. So, as I said, Zamami-jima has very affordable accommodation, and that is because Zamami-jima has a campground. The beautiful thing about the campground on Zamami-jima is that you can walk there from the port town. It's about a 15 to 20 minute walk, and that means that during the day or at night you can walk back to the port town for dinner or lunch, or to grab a drink in the evening, and that makes it fairly ideal because you have a bigger town close by for supplies or whatever you need. It's also great in terms of where the campground is located. It's located right next to one of the 2 main beaches on Zamami-jima, and that beach is the beach where I spotted turtles on 2 of my trips. So it's in a very good location. You can also take a bus to that campground / beach. So if you don't want to walk, don't be worried. There are buses that usually can bring you from the ferry to the campground with all your stuff. There aren't buses that frequently. I think they only run right before the ferry departs and right after it comes in. But at least you can take a ferry to get your stuff over. Also, there are some other really nice things about Zamami-jima. So the port area has a grocery store, which is great if you are camping on the island, and it has lots and lots of cafes and restaurants. So you will definitely be able to find somewhere to eat. And there is at least one viewpoint that you can reach by foot, which is also not the case on all of the islands. But Zamami-jima has at least one viewpoint you can hike up to. I would say it's like a 30-minute hike up and another 30 minutes back down, maybe. And it's also really, really easy on Zamami-jima to borrow bicycles or scooters. And my personal favorite activities on Zamami-jima are actually hiking up to the viewpoint that's closest to the port town, just strolling around the port town. It's a really small town, but it's amazing how much you can just discover strolling around this little town. Snorkeling next to the campgrounds and also having a barbecue at the campground. So I believe we had a barbecue every single time I went to Zamami-jima. So every single time I went to Zamami-jima, I went camping and we had a barbecue every single time, and it was always a good time. And you can rent barbecues at the campground and it's pretty affordable. My favorite way by far is to get around the island by scooter. It's a very hilly island, so you can cycle, but with all the hills, it's kind of a difficult endeavor. So yeah, I prefer having a scooter, and also a scooter allows you to drive around the whole island in a reasonable time. So you can visit all the viewpoints that are on Zamami. There are a total of 5 viewpoints on Zamami. And you can then continue driving to the northeast tip of Zamami, where we saw, so when we did it, we saw 0 other people at the northeast tip of Zamami-jima. And yeah, it allows you to visit both beaches, Ama Beach, which is the beach in front of the campground, and Furu Zamami Beach, which is the other campground. And as I said, Ama Beach and the campground can be reached by bus, and the same is also true for the second beach. So if you don't have a scooter, you could also take the bus to get to the other beach. So how can you actually get to Zamami-jima? Let's say you're on Okinawa Honto and you want to go to Zamami-jima. Well, in order to get to Zamami-jima, you would have to take a ferry from Tomalin Port in Naha City. There are 2 types of ferries. There is a high-speed ferry that brings you from Naha or Tomalin Port in Naha to Zamami-jima in about 50 to 70 minutes. And there is a standard ferry that takes anywhere between 1.5 to 2 hours. If you take the standard ferry, you can bring a passenger car if there is space. As of now, that is March 2021, the price to take the high-speed ferry is 3,140 yen one way, so that's around $30 US, or 5,970 yen for a round trip, so that's around, I want to say, $55 US. And for the standard ferry, it's 2,120 yen one way per person, so that's around $20 US, or 4,030 yen for a round trip, so that's somewhere between 35 to 40 US dollars. And as I said, you can bring your car on the standard ferry, so there is an option to bring your car, and whether you can bring your car or not depends on whether there is space or not. And if you want to bring your car, you have to book a spot for your car on the ferry in advance. So prices for bringing a car with you vary on the car size, and you have to inquire with someone at the office to figure out how much it is, whether there is a spot available, and also to book a spot. Which brings us to how can you actually book a ticket. And that's what we usually did, is to book by phone. So in that case, you have to call the office in Naha, so the office at Tomalin Port, and tell them how many people you want to bring, whether you want to bring a car, and they will tell you whether there is an availability for that many people and a car, or whatever you want to book for on the day you want to book for. And if there is no availability on the day you want to book for, they can usually tell you availabilities for other days. And there is usually one person in the office at Tomalin Port that speaks English. And if you call and you tell them, or you ask for an English-speaking person, and they tell you that no one is available, or they answer you in Japanese and don't hand you over to someone else, try to phone again later. If you speak a little Japanese, you're probably able to inquire how long it is till the person comes back. But if you don't worry, just call again like 20-30 minutes later. So now, how do you actually book accommodation on Zamami-jima? As I said, you can do it as a day trip, especially, so if you do it as a day trip, I would not take the standard ferry and I would not take a passenger car. But if you take the high-speed ferry there in the morning and then back in the evening, you can definitely do Zamami-jima as a day trip. But let's say you want to do it as a weekend trip, which, as I said, I would highly encourage. How do you book a camping spot or accommodation? So to book a camping spot, you will have to call them. And by them, I mean the campground on Zamami-jima. So you will have to phone up the campground on Zamami-jima. And as far as I know, the campground personnel only speaks Japanese. So ask your Japanese friend for help. And if you don't have Japanese friends, go out and make some. So that's how you book the campground. It's also very straightforward. They almost always have space, so don't worry. And you can actually rent, I believe, tents and sleeping bags. So if you don't have all the gear, you can rent that from the campground too. So that's the logistics. But let's say you don't want to stay on the campground, which I understand. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of camping either. There are several hotels on Zamami that you can reserve via booking.com, but there are also many hotels on Zamami that are actually not bookable via booking.com or other websites where you would usually book a hotel. And the thing is, those options that aren't available on booking.com are usually the cheaper options. So, as I said, there are cheaper options that don't have a presence online, and usually you would email or phone them to book them or to make a reservation. And I will link a list below in the description of the video with accommodation that has English-speaking staff, and where you can email the accommodation to reserve a room. So yeah, that's I'm not sure how up to date that list is, but I found one list that has accommodation on Zamami-jima with English speaking stuff and email addresses and phone numbers. And so yeah, look in the description below for a link and email or phone them to make a reservation. So now where you know how to get there and how to reserve a room or a spot on the campground, well, really all that's left for you is to reserve your ferry ticket and reserve a spot on the campground or a room, and to enjoy Zamami-jima for a day or the weekend. So yeah, if you like this video, please leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and that's it for today. Matane, and I will see you again next week. Bye!